Hi, I'm Susie Garden, and this is the Ageless and Awesome podcast. I'm an age-defying naturopath and clinical nutritionist, and I'm here to bust myths around women's health and aging so that you can be ageless and awesome in your 40s, 50s, and beyond. The Ageless and Awesome podcast is dedicated to helping women through perimenopause and menopause with great health, a positive mindset, and outrageous confidence. Hit subscribe or follow now, and let's get started. Hello, gorgeous woman, and welcome to Q&A Thursday. And this week is a really common question. So the question I had was from Tanya in Melbourne, but honestly, I probably get this question at least once a week from women in my programs or in clinic. And essentially the question is, do I actually have heavy periods, or are my periods normal? And it's interesting because as naturopaths, this is a question we ask on our initial consultation of every single woman that comes through our doors. And sometimes it's the first time they've actually been asked in detail about their period. It's not something that tends to happen in a standard GP consultation. It certainly, as I've never been asked that in a GP consultation. And it's really interesting. And I certainly found it interesting when I first started practicing and in student clinic, is the variation between woman to woman in terms of the flow, the duration of flow. So how many days of flow, and then how heavy that flow is. And I think it's really important that you kind of have an idea of whether your flow is actually kind of, I don't really want to use the word normal, but let's say appropriate maybe. I don't know if that's the right word either. But yeah, like I'll never forget one day I had someone in clinic, this just to give you an example, who said that her flow was normal. And I said, okay, tell me about, your flow. And I asked her specifically, like how many tampons do you use in a day? On a heavy day. And she said she had 2 heavy days. And she said 12. And I went, oh, okay, so is that 12 regular or 12 super tampons? And that was 12 super tampons per day for 2 days, plus overnight she wore a super pad and she had to get up and change it. And occasionally she actually flooded through her tampon. So we're going to talk about all of this and why this is relevant. So that's an exceptionally heavy period, but she thought it was normal. And she was constantly having issues with iron deficiency, but hadn't had any really big discussion with her GP about how heavy her periods actually were. So we delved into that. So to give you some kind of benchmarking here, what is considered normal for an average period is 80 mils of flow or blood, whatever you want to call it, 80 mils. And a regular tampon holds 5 mils. A super tampon holds 12 mils. So if you're using 12 super tampons a day, that's 144 mils times 2 days, 288 mils plus overnight, plus the other days, because she was bleeding for 7 days. That is probably close to actually it's more than 3 times what would be considered normal. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this. So 80 mils, you can lock that in. That is what's considered normal. And we don't really have any benchmarking over how many days should be heavy, how many days should be light, etc. So for many women that I speak to, generally there'll be 1, maybe 2 days that they'll consider their heavier days, and the rest is where it's kind of either leading up to the heavy day, which is usually 1 day before, sometimes not, and then maybe 3 to 5 days after is kind of petering off the flow every single day. And what's great now is I'm seeing, particularly with the younger women that I see in clinic, a lot of them are using cups. So you actually have an exact kind of measure of what the flow is. So that is fantastic. But we do know if you use undies, for example, if you go on the website and you look up the type of undies that you've purchased, it will tell you what it holds, the equivalent of, regular tampons, super tampons, whatever, it will tell you. And then you can calculate that to work out what your own flow is so that you do know what is normal. Now, you may have heard of the term flooding. I think I just used it, or a gush, and that's often questions that I will ask women when I'm assessing their menstrual cycle is to have they ever had a gush or a flooding. And what that means is a sensation of essentially a gush that comes through the tampon. And you may have this also if you're wearing a pad where you get like this sudden gush of fluid that you feel, and sometimes that can actually overflow the pad, overflow the tampon. I've had a couple of women actually that have had instances where blood, and it's not unusual, usually will happen them once every cycle, is that they'll get blood running down their legs. And so obviously that is something that we don't want. Nobody wants that. And so if you are you listening to this and you're going, gosh, my period's actually very heavy, it is heavier than 80 mils, then please, have a conversation with your GP about it, or your healthcare professional. Go and see a naturopath. Certainly you can get in contact with me if that's something that you think, gosh, I think I need to get this investigated. And in the context of menopause and perimenopause, let's bring it back to that, because let's face it, most of my listeners, I know this for sure, most of my listeners are in the age group where they may be having some erratic periods, they may be having heavier or lighter periods, or a little bit of a combination from cycle to cycle. Or perhaps you're having, it's been a few months since you've had a period, and then all of a sudden you get like the period from hell, which can totally happen. And these are just normal things that happen with the variation of hormones that we get in perimenopause and menopause, unfortunately. Not so much if you do the true definition of menopause, which is 12 months after your last period, then it's unlikely you're going to get any more periods. So, but I know that some people are still across that terminology, which is why I tend to use both terms so that we kind of are all on the same page. So, yeah. Is your period flow normal? Essentially, if it's more than 80 mils, then no, it's not. And please get that checked out. And also, if you're experiencing, iron deficiency, if you haven't had your blood tested for a while and you're really fatigued, breathless, find it difficult to sleep, things like that, then sometimes, again, these are all potentially symptoms of perimenopause as well. So those symptoms are not necessarily helpful. However, you can get your blood tested and know for sure whether or not you're iron deficient. And then if you also know that you're having heavy periods, then, that needs to be looked into to see what that underlying cause actually is. Because there are a number of conditions that can cause those heavier periods. Obviously, endometriosis is the major one that comes to mind, but sometimes it can be things like fibroids, it can be adenomyosis. There's a number of conditions. So we want to make sure that that's getting looked at and treated accordingly. So, and one of the main things, I guess, this last parting bit of advice on Q&A Thursday is to track your cycle. This is so awesome now as a practitioner because your smartphones have all come with inbuilt apps, or an app for tracking your cycle, and there's heaps of fantastic apps out there as well that help you track. And I think that's really important, particularly if you are in a position where you've got erratic kind of cycles. Then tracking can really help you to get an understanding of what's going on in your body. And we really look at it from a natural health point of view as a monthly kind of health check on what's going on in your body. So if you can track, then you'll know if things are different to how they normally are. And then you can have a chat with your healthcare practitioner about that and whether or not any kind of intervention or investigation is warranted. So I hope that's been helpful. If you have any specific questions about this, I would love to hear from you. I love talking about this stuff. And yeah, if you feel like leaving me a 5-star review, I would love to read it. Thanks so much for joining me today on the Ageless and Awesome podcast. If you liked today's episode, please make sure you click the little plus button if you're on Apple Podcasts or the follow button if you're on Spotify so that you can get each new episode delivered to you every single week. If you like free stuff, and who doesn't, then head over to susiegarden.com and grab my 8 essential age-defying secrets every woman over 40 should know right now. Or if you'd like to continue the discussion, head over to Instagram and DM me at Susie Garden Wellness. I'd love to connect with you.